I want to start with something uncomfortable. There is a version of someone walking through life constantly explaining themselves, justifying their decisions, reacting to every provocation, defending their choices to people who were never actually looking for an explanation, they were looking for a reaction. And here's the thing nobody says out loud. That person is not weak. That person is just unaware. Because the moment someone realizes that their attention is the most valuable thing they possess, the moment they understand that silence is not emptiness, it is power, everything shifts. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this centuries before modern psychology had a name for it. He understood that the most dangerous, most commanding, most untouchable people in any room were never the loudest ones. They were the ones who could not be rattled. This video is about 7 psychological principles drawn from that understanding. Not tricks in the cheap sense. Principles about how energy works, how attention functions, and what happens when someone finally stops performing for an audience that was never worth the performance. I call it the architecture of being untouchable. I want to start with something that most people have completely backwards. Attention is not free. It is not unlimited. It is not something to scatter generously in every direction like it costs nothing. Attention is a currency. And like any currency, where it goes is where value gets assigned. Think about how an investor approaches capital. A serious investor does not throw money at every opportunity that presents itself. There is evaluation. There is discernment. There is a quiet but absolute decision about what deserves a return and what does not. Most people treat their attention like someone who throws money at every street vendor they pass and then wonders why they are broke. Here is the psychological reality beneath that. When someone drains energy, when they provoke, manipulate, demand, or simply absorb without giving anything back, and the response is attention, what just happened is validation. The behavior has been confirmed as worthwhile. The signal sent is, doing that worked. Every moment of attention given to someone who does not deserve it is a withdrawal from a finite account. And when that account runs low, there is nothing left for the things and people that actually matter. Machiavelli wrote about the economy of power, about how it is not resources that determine dominance, but allocation. The person who allocates intentionally always outlasts the person who gives away everything. The quiet shift happens when attention stops being reflexive and becomes deliberate. Not cold. Not cruel. Deliberate. And that deliberateness is felt, immediately, by everyone around. Because there is something quietly commanding about a person who is clearly not available to just anyone. Here is where it gets interesting. Most people think silence is passive. An absence of action. A non-choice. It is not. Silence is one of the most aggressive psychological moves available, and it costs nothing. Here is why. When someone says something provocative, something designed to get a reaction, to pull someone into conflict, to test composure, and the response is a measured, deliberate nothing, something extraordinary happens inside that person. They are left alone with themselves. And that is the most uncomfortable place many people know how to be. Because the provocation was never really about the other person. It was about managing their own internal discomfort by outsourcing it. By making someone else react, they get a form of emotional relief. Conflict becomes a way of not sitting with themselves. Silence removes that escape route entirely. There is a deeper layer here too. Every word offered in self-defense, in explanation, in reactive anger, is a piece of information. It reveals what matters. It shows what threatens. It hands over a psychological map. Silence gives away nothing. Machiavelli was relentless about this, that the person who speaks less reveals less, and the person who reveals less is harder to oppose. There is something that feels almost supernatural about someone who simply does not react. Because reaction is what people are trained to expect. Silence breaks the pattern. And broken patterns create a very specific kind of unease in the person who caused them. They begin to wonder. And that wondering does more damage to their confidence than any argument ever could. There is a word that often gets misunderstood here: distance. People hear distance and they think abandonment, disappearance, avoidance. And sometimes it is used that way, chaotically, reactively, as a form of punishment. But strategic withdrawal is something entirely different. Strategic withdrawal is not about going away. It is about being selectively present. And there is a psychological principle underneath that distinction that most people never learn, the principle of perceived scarcity. Value follows rarity. That is true in economics. It is true in psychology. And it is true in how human beings experience one another. When someone is constantly available, when they respond immediately, appear at every invitation, never create any space, there is a certain flatness to their presence. Not because they are uninteresting, but because there is no contrast, no mystery, no moment where someone wonders where they are. Now consider someone who is sometimes completely present and sometimes quietly absent. Someone whose attention, when it arrives, feels earned rather than automatic. The same person. Two completely different psychological impacts. Strategic withdrawal is the practice of controlling that contrast intentionally. It is not manipulation in the destructive sense. It is the recognition that presence without selectivity is a form of self-erasure. That being everywhere for everyone means being truly seen by no one. There is something Machiavellian about it, and also something deeply self-respecting. Because the person practicing strategic withdrawal has made a decision, the presence is not infinite, not unconditional, not automatic. And that decision alone changes how the presence is received. This one is the one that makes people uncomfortable, because it sounds harsh. But I want to explain what is actually happening psychologically, because the science of it is extraordinary. Human beings are wired for closure. The brain experiences unresolved social interactions the way it experiences an open loop, as something incomplete, something that demands resolution. Psychologists call it the Zeigarnik effect. Unfinished things occupy more mental space than finished ones. When someone is ignored, genuinely, cleanly, completely ignored, they are left with an open loop they cannot close. And here is the critical part. The brain, desperate for resolution, will begin to fill in the silence with its own material. That material is almost never flattering to itself. The person who provoked and got no response will begin to replay the interaction. To second-guess. To wonder what was said, what was done, whether something went wrong. The absence of a reaction becomes, paradoxically, a mirror, and what they see in it is their own behavior reflected back without the cushion of the other person's response. This is not cruelty. It is physics. The need for closure is a deeply human need. And the person who provides no closure controls the psychological gravity of the entire interaction without lifting a finger. Machiavelli understood that the most effective power is often the power that is never explicitly exercised. Ignoring is not doing nothing. It is doing everything, through the deliberate absence of response. The person being ignored does not experience silence as nothing. They experience it as a presence. An uncomfortable, relentless, undeniable presence. And that presence requires absolutely no effort. Machiavelli categorized adversaries. He did not treat them all the same, because they are not all the same. There are three types worth understanding. The first is the enemy, someone in direct opposition. Open conflict. This person is at least honest about their position. The strategy here is clear boundaries, minimal engagement, no ammunition offered. The second is the critic, someone whose primary function is commentary. They observe and evaluate from a safe distance. They rarely risk anything themselves. The strategy here is radical indifference. The critic feeds on response. No response starves them entirely. The third, and the most dangerous, is the energy parasite. This person does not announce their hostility. They come close. They absorb. They take warmth, time, attention, emotional labor, and they give back a slow, invisible drain. These are the hardest to identify because they often wear the face of friendship. The strategy for energy parasites is the only one that actually works: total removal. Not argument. Not confrontation. Not the satisfaction of an explanation. Removal. Because here is the psychological reality. Every minute in the proximity of an energy parasite is a minute not spent building, creating, moving forward. The cost is invisible day-to-day and devastating over time. The most powerful thing any person can do for their own trajectory is to audit who has access. Not from bitterness. Not from superiority. From self-preservation. Machiavelli was not sentimental about this. Access is earned. And it can be revoked. Here is the reframe that changes everything. Indifference is not the absence of emotion. Indifference is the sovereignty of emotion. There is a version of indifference that is numbing, shutting down, going cold, disconnecting from everything. That is not what this is. That is just a different kind of wound. The indifference that functions as armor is something else entirely. It is the capacity to observe external provocation without being governed by it. To feel the pull of a reaction and then, consciously, deliberately, choose not to follow it. The psychological term for this is emotional regulation. But Machiavelli did not call it that. He called it the mark of someone whose interior world could not be accessed by the exterior chaos of others. And this is what makes it armor rather than numbness. It does not close someone off from genuine connection. It simply removes the ability of toxic dynamics to cause internal damage. How does this develop? Slowly. Through the recognition of triggers. Every person has specific patterns that create automatic reactions. Certain tones, certain words, certain behaviors that bypass the thinking mind and go straight to the nervous system. Learning what those patterns are is the beginning of deactivating them. Not suppressing. Not denying. Deactivating, creating a pause between stimulus and response where a choice can be made. That pause is where power lives. The person who cannot be triggered cannot be controlled. And the person who cannot be controlled, who sits quietly, unbothered, while everything around them attempts to create chaos, is genuinely untouchable. Not because nothing affects them. Because they have decided what is allowed in. The final principle is perhaps the most counterintuitive. The highest level of strategic thinking is often the decision to do nothing. This sounds passive. It is not. Calculated inaction is the recognition that most conflicts, most provocations, most dramas, if left completely alone, will collapse under their own weight. They are designed to pull someone in. The moment they succeed in pulling someone in, they have already won. The person who refuses to enter the arena denies the conflict its energy source. But there is something deeper happening too. While the conflict burns itself out, while the chaos that was designed to destabilize runs its course, the person practicing calculated inaction is doing something else entirely. They are building. They are growing. They are investing their energy in directions that produce real return. This is the ultimate Machiavellian insight. The people who appear to be doing nothing are often the ones doing the most. They have simply stopped spending resources on battles that were never worth winning. And they have redirected everything, every unit of attention, every hour, every ounce of emotional energy, toward the architecture of something that matters. It is not avoidance. It is prioritization at the highest level. The person who learns to win by not playing is the person who eventually wins at everything else. So here is what all 7 of these principles have in common. None of them require loudness. None of them require aggression. None of them require announcing themselves. They are all interior decisions that produce exterior effects. The guarded attention. The deliberate silence. The strategic distance. The unbroken composure. The clean removal of what no longer deserves access. The armor that cannot be penetrated. The stillness that lets chaos destroy itself. These are not tricks in the cheap sense. They are principles of self-possession. And the person who internalizes them does not become cold. They become clear. They do not become cruel. They become intentional. There is a version of moving through the world where everything lands, every provocation, every opinion, every attempt to destabilize. And there is another version where the movement is calm, deliberate, genuinely untouchable. The difference between those two versions is not talent. It is not circumstances. It is awareness. Once this pattern is seen clearly, once it is understood how attention functions as currency, how silence functions as force, how indifference functions as armor, it cannot be unseen. And that awareness alone changes everything. If this opens something up, there is more to uncover. Understanding how the mind works, how power actually moves, that is the beginning of something different. Comment below with the words, "I own my attention," because that is where it starts. Not with the world changing first. With the decision.